We're going to finish up our American Revolution story with a couple of battles in the West and the South. In this case, the West means west of the Appalachian Mountains. A lot of the war so far has been fought in the New England colonies and then in the middle colonies, and now the British are going to shift the focus of the war to the South, but there is some stuff going on out in what we would consider the West. This painting is in the Capitol Rotunda in Washington, D.C. It's called Presenting the Declaration. We saw this the other day when Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and others, a committee of five, presenting their Declaration of Independence to John Hancock and the the Continental Congress. This is a big moment in American history. Also a big moment in 1777 when the British surrender at Saratoga, New York. This painting is also hanging in the U.S. Capitol Dome Rotunda in Washington, D.C. Have somebody take you down there so you can see these things. This statue is a little weird, maybe a lot weird. Kind of a funny story is in the middle 1800s, like you see this statue where this statue was done in 1832. In the middle 1800s, there was kind of a movement to honor all the people who had fought in the American Revolution. That Revolutionary War generation was quickly leaving us in the 1830s. There weren't a lot of them left. So a lot of artwork was done to honor those people, including this sculpture of George Washington looking like a Greek god. Probably none of us have really ever thought of George Washington with no shirt on before. Kind of a funny thing about this monument or this statue is it was first on display in the United States Capitol building, and so many people were like, ew, what is that? That they took it downstairs and put it in the basement of the Capitol where it wouldn't be seen. Even at that, eventually they put a cover over it so people wouldn't have to see it. Today it's in the National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. It's one of the Smithsonian's. Hey, you can go there and see it too if you want. Well, what's going on out in the West? Well, Vincennes, Indiana, and the West, there's this American man who's like, hey, we're way out here in the West, but we think we can have some impact on the war by trying to defeat the British in some forts they have out here in the Western territories. So George Rogers Clark, yes, a Clark. It's got to go well if it's a Clark, right? Well, George Rogers Clark was able to recruit some soldiers, sort of, recruit some Native Americans, and scare the British into surrendering in a few places. Maybe you have not heard of George Rogers Clark before. You may possibly have heard of his much younger brother, William Clark, who traveled with Meriwether Lewis in the famous Lewis and Clark exploration. So the war in the West and Vincennes out there in the Ohio Valley, the Americans are winning a lot. George Rogers Clark, Americans will capture the Ohio River Valley from the British. It's not the last time we'll hear about the British in the Ohio River Valley, so hang on for more of that coming up in a couple weeks. Now, just to explain to you what the British are doing in the South, the British are going to invade Savannah, Georgia. Remember, the United States has no navy. We can't stop them from invading by water. The British are going to land in Savannah, Georgia. Later on, the French Navy is going to come help us out with such things. The British are going to begin their invasion of the South in Savannah, and they're going to try to fight their way back north. Now, you may notice on the screen here, this is number 17. It really should be number 14. Typo there on my part. From Charleston, South Carolina, the British also will capture that because they can sail right into a port city like Charleston, South Carolina, because we don't really have any defenses and we have no navy. Hold on to that thought later on, too, when we get to the Civil War and how there is a fort out there in Charleston Harbor, and that's its own special story. But the British invasion at Charleston is successful, but they know they have to go inland to defeat the Americans. And the more the British travel inland, the less successful they become. They get far away from their base of operations and far away from their supply lines, and the Americans wind up beating them on several occasions, which is really surprising to the British. There's one of those famous battles is called Cowpens. Well, it looks like Cowpens anyway. Locals call it Cuppens. Is it named for big cowpens? Yes, it is. That was a place, I guess, locally. Everybody knew that's where you went to buy cattle or sell cattle. There were cow pens there, and that's how the town got its name. But really interesting story about how the American Army puts these little militia soldiers out in their front lines, and as soon as they're encountered by the British, they turn around and run and look like they're running away. But the geography is such that the British can't see where this front line of people is going. They don't know they've joined a second line that's already back here. But that second line does the same trick. When they are attacked by the British, they turn around and run away. But the British don't know they're joining a third line, and that kind of lures the British in to go attack, keep pushing their attack. They think they're winning, and all of a sudden, boom, they have run into a sizable American army, and the British are defeated. Maybe you've seen a movie called The Patriot, starring Mel Gibson. That movie was filmed about a man, or the story is about a man who lived in the American South, an American patriot. See Mel Gibson there charging with some of his war equipment on and his American flag. So that's a movie that maybe you've seen before, which tells some of the story of the American Revolutionary War in the South. Some of it, of course, is a made up story for a movie, but some of it has some actual good history in it also. Now, the last battle of our war in our American Revolution takes place at Yorktown, Virginia, October 17th, 1781. By this point, the war has been on for more than 6 years, uh, and the British are just going to give up at this point. We'll do some of that story later on, but that's how the Revolutionary War is going to end in Yorktown, Virginia. Remember that name, Yorktown, Virginia. Not the same as York, Pennsylvania, not far from us in Hanover. Yorktown, Virginia. British General Cornwallis, Charles Cornwallis, surrenders to end the war. There are some famous names involved on the American side in that battle. George Washington, of course, is one of them. Alexander Hamilton is one of them. So maybe you've heard those names. Those are big names in American history. Maybe you're even familiar with a musical that's been out recently on Broadway called Hamilton, telling the story of Alexander Hamilton's life. Supposedly, when the British surrendered, the British in red coats, a white flag of surrender, their defenses behind them burning. That's what all the gray smoke is from. The British band played a song called The World Turned Upside Down because the world really had been turned upside down. The colonies have defeated the all powerful mother country. That's not supposed to happen. The mother country is supposed to have all the power and all the strength, but they've lost. The world has been turned upside down. Now, in a way, The World Turned Upside Down is a silly song, maybe like you learned when you were children, songs that don't really make sense. Some of the words reflecting the idea of a colony's overthrowing their mother country say, if buttercups buzzed after the bee, if boats were on land, churches on sea, if ponies rode men, and if grass ate the cows, and cats should be chased into holes by the mouse, if the mamas sold their babies to the gypsies for half a crown, if summer were spring and the other way round, then all the world would be upside down. And the world really was upside down. The Americans have beaten the strongest, best army in the world, the British Army. This is a picture from a still picture from a version of the musical Hamilton. One of the songs in the show is called The World Turned Upside Down. It's about the end of the revolution, still taking that theme of what the song that the British band was probably playing at the time the British had to surrender to end the American Revolution. Well, what happens after that? George Washington resigns from being in charge of the army. See, a lot of people are wondering what's going to become. America is now an independent country. George Washington should become the king of America. Kind of an old mindset where we can't really think outside of having a king because that's what we've always had. George Washington says, no, I will not be a king. He goes back to Congress, hands in his letter of resignation, saying this Congress now has the power and the problems of defining what America is going to be like. And by the way, here's Mrs. Martha Washington up in the gallery watching. America wins its independence. It's all over. The revolution is over. This is a really great thing for us. The Treaty of Paris is signed in 1783 to end the war 2 years after the fighting ended. These men, gentlemen sitting in the seats, are some Americans who have come to sign final surrender papers. The artist never finished the painting, and that's on purpose because the British people supposed to come sign wouldn't come. They were so embarrassed at losing to the Americans that they wouldn't even come sign the surrender papers. So we're independent. What do we do next? It's kind of the idea of this young lady moving out of her parents' house. They're waving goodbye, and off she goes. Well, we're going to find in America that it's really hard to be independent. We might think, oh, hey, when we move out of our house, here's some things we're going to do first. Going to fill up the screen or the fridge with my food, the things I want to eat. I'm staying up as late as I want. No more limits or whatever rules my parents might have had for me. Well, America's going to think, yay, being independent is great. But, well, maybe you're familiar with the boomerang generation, adults aged 25 to 34 years old who have moved out of their family home, but because they couldn't do it on their own, they had to move back again. America's kind of like that. We are in big trouble. Yes, we're independent. Yes, we like that. But we're going to find out pretty quickly that it's really hard to be independent. And we'll learn some stories about how we are just about to be taken over again by the British and maybe some other countries. But for now, the American Revolution is over. That's great. We really enjoy our independence. We're glad we have it, even though it's going to be quite a struggle to keep it.